So we're going to be talking about the tools for developing communication plans for this hour. And the first, all right, so the Communication Bill of Rights. I think it's really great to use with staff members where you're trying to convince them why we have to do all these things that pertain to communication and providing communication opportunities. This is a really great document to share with team members on the IEP to tell them that everybody should have the right to these opportunities. So students with disabilities, like all students out there, should have the opportunity to fully participate in all aspects of their curriculum. I'm going to turn my video off just because it's distracting me. Okay. All right. So that means like academic participation, social participation, and vocational participation. So even though you think that they may not be able to perform academically on level, they should still have the opportunity to participate in those academic activities at their level. Okay. Um, so that's kind of what this whole Communication Bill of Rights states, is that you should give them the opportunity to participate. It doesn't mean that they have to participate on level. It just means that they have the opportunity to be a contributing member to that activity, social interaction, vocational interaction. Um, so that's really important. If typically the student doesn't have a constructive way to communicate, what that ends up looking like for a nonverbal student is behavior. So you might start seeing hitting and biting and fleeing, and that's all a direct result of them not being able to effectively communicate in that environment. So a communication plan is one of the most important things in the IEP for a nonverbal child. Okay. So we're going to kind of get into looking at that and talking about the process and stuff. Okay. So here's the why. Why do we have to write this communication plan? When it first came out, people were like kind of frantic, running around going, what do we have to do now? Oh my God. So these are the three big laws that support this mandate of a communication plan within the IEP. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I'm just letting you know that this is the why. And so let's talk about the who and a little bit more details about who we're talking about. So it's not just for students who receive speech therapy services, and it's not for all students who receive speech therapy services. The purpose of the communication plan is to have a conversation about their communication needs. Okay, so you want them to be able to receive information and convey information. So the key to deciding what is needed is to consider like where they're going to be communicating, what environment they're going to be communicating in, how long they're going to be asked to communicate. If they're asked to communicate a really long time, some kids that have speech, issues may not be able to have the breath or the muscle power to effectively communicate because of maybe a motor impairment. How complex they are having to communicate, if they're having to communicate language or words they have not learned to say yet. That's important. And with the context. So also, some kids communicate through facial expressions and gestures. Um, if a person can't see that child in that environment, how are they going to better read those gestures and those facial expressions? So you need to know, like, where does the child have to be to fully and effectively communicate in that environment? So there's a lot of things to think about and talk about when you're making and discussing with the IP team an effective communication plan. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about who. All right. So who qualifies for having the need for a communication plan? This has caused a lot of debate in our field about who needs a communication plan. These three blocks on the screen right now say these are definitely the kids who need a communication plan. So kids that are deaf, hard of hearing, or blind, there should be a communication plan. Limited verbal or no verbal skills. Okay, if a child is standing in an environment where they cannot advocate for themselves with language that is understandable by a stranger, then that is definitely limited verbal skills. If the child can make out words and a stranger could understand them, then they may not need a communication plan. Like they just have a few little um, issues with speech. And then, of course, the last block, other significant impairment with receptive or expressive language. These three areas, okay? So, for example, when a non-disabled peer comes to school, and let's say they come in at a pre-K level, they already have 1,000 to 2,000 words that they can speak if they don't have a speech issue. So imagine if a child had a speech issue and they only had 300 words they could talk with, they're going to be at a serious disadvantage communicatively if they're trying to compete with kids that are speaking 2,000 words. um, we're not saying that some of these kids are not going to become verbal at some point in their educational experience, which a lot of kids do develop, but they develop a little bit later than some kids. So, in that pre-K stage, if they only have two words, they may need a communication plan. If they have an IEP, of course they should. Um, so we're saying kids like that are included but not limited to this population. Maybe a student with apraxia, articulation or phonology, problems, fluency, definitely, pragmatics or auditory processing. Um, what becomes confusing in the IEP process is kids who qualify for speech in that qualification and documentation, it'll say significant impairment. And that might just mean that they have, severe articulation issues. Just because they have severe articulation issues doesn't mean they can't say and advocate for themselves in the environment. So that's where it gets kind of cloudy with who needs a plan. Sometimes we say, oh, these kids with severe articulation issues might need a communication plan. Well, you have to talk about that as an IEP team. If that child can advocate for themselves, and if they can get their point across, um, in their environment, a lot of kids figure out how to communicate and use other modes and can actually, communicate in their environment, and they can get their point across. And if they're able to do that and they just have some severe articulation problems, they may not need a communication plan. So it's really that IEP team's decision as to whether or not how severe their communication issues are. Um, so artic kids may not need a communication plan. It just depends. And then the fluency children, um, sometimes they are, uh, so involved that they might have a problem in certain settings, but in other settings they really struggle. Um, if you have a polling that's up on your window right now, just hit the red X to close it out. That may just be our panelist. Okay. All right. So what I would like to do now is talk a little bit more about the communication plan. So Josh, if you can submit my launch my poll now, I want to poll the audience real quick again about whether or not the district or IEP teams in your district, do they write do they have or get trained on writing effective communication plans within your district? um, just to kind of see like how the audience and how much experience they have with the communication plan. Some districts years ago or a couple years ago adopted their own methods for writing this plan. um, so I just want to kind of see from the audience, does your district train on the IP teams on writing effective communication plans? Maybe you might not even know what a communication plan is. And this is really important for those nonverbal students that come across your roster and you're just not quite sure how you're going to facilitate their communication within the setting that you're trying to teach them in. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it a few more minutes because only 67% of you voted. So if you can look at the question on your screen right now, it says, does your district train IEP teams on writing effective communication plans? Just say yes, no, or what is a communication plan? I'm going to wait till about 80% of you voted. And then I'll go ahead and end the poll and I'll share it with everybody so that that's 80%. I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. That's gonna pop up on your screen in a window. When you're finished seeing the results, you can hit the X on your window to get that away from your window. So it looks like 53 of us do get trained in your district on how to write an effective communication plan. 42, so it's kind of like half and half. So writing an effective communication plan can make or break that student's experience, you know, because if you don't know, um, if you don't know how the child's going to communicate in an environment where you're expected to teach them, then that's a serious issue. Because how are you going to know what they're learning and what they're not learning if they can't effectively communicate in that environment? So I'm going to close out this poll and let's just talk about the communication plan in a little bit more depth. Okay. Sorry, I'm monitoring a couple of screens. All right. Okay, if you have any questions about what I'm talking about, if you can just put them in the Q&A and we can reserve the chat feature for any technical issues. I'm going to go ahead and just look at the chat real quick. All right. Okay. All right, so if you have any questions, again, put them in the Q&A and we have a moderator that's going to read them to me verbally as we go out. Okay, so again, the communication plan is a method for ensuring that you meet the student's needs as it applies to the law. Okay. Basically it's a way of showing how you're complying with the law. And so the plan itself, the process of the plan, I mean, the plan, like how you do it is not mandated, but the creating of the plan, the saying that communication was considered, and then writing maybe some objectives on the IEP for a child who is nonverbal, that is what's mandatory. You know, if a child cannot speak auditorily to advocate for themselves or to participate in that activity in the classroom, if they cannot verbally advocate for themselves, then you must write a plan of how they're going to participate in their academic and social environment within the school setting. Okay, so let's get into talking about what the DOE has created to facilitate that. And so what I have on my slide deck right here is the link out to the tools for developing communication plans. Those of you that answered, you do get trained in your district on how to create a communication plan. Your district may have opted out of using this exact tool, but I'm going to share this tool for all the people that their district may have not chosen a tool to use to create a communication plan or an effective communication plan, so that you can kind of look over this document and maybe reach out to people in the district and say, what are we doing for this for nonverbal students? Because I know that there's a lot of students out there that do not communicate through verbal speech that really could benefit from their IEP team sitting down and creating an effective communication plan to use across environments. Okay. All right. So this is just a guide for teams to develop a communication plan. Again, this is not mandatory, but considering a communication need within a child for a child who is nonverbal and can't effectively communicate is what's mandatory. So you must write that into the IEP. I'm going to get into the IEP section at the end of this presentation to show you where in the IEP you must write down your communication goals and objectives and plan. So this is a 16-page document. So I'll pull it up real quick just to show you. This is the document. It's 16 pages. just know that not all 16 pages are actually the end result of the preparation and the planning. Um, so I just want you to to know that it's kind of it seems really daunting, but um, in reality, there's only 3 parts of it, and the actual plan is like only 3 pages, I want to say. So I think when people first saw this document, um, everybody kind of panicked because it was like, oh God, we got to do this and everything else. So just know that it's just a tool. Um,
Tammy, there's a
yeah,
question.
okay.
You ready for it?
Yes,
Uh,
ma'am.
should a plan be written for a nonverbal 3-year-old student is not that who I gotta think it's who is not enrolled in a school setting but is being seen for bring in services?
Okay. All right. So I kind of made a little comment earlier about preschool students having 1,000 to 2,000 words, like a typically functioning student that comes into pre-K maybe with some words, right? And they could kind of talk verbally. A child that doesn't have a speech issue. Compare that, okay, so like a 3-year-old student that says no words to a pre-K student that might have 1,000 words in their bank. Compare those two students' interaction in that classroom setting and their advocacy for oneself. It's not a level playing field when you think about those kinds of students that come in with all those verbal words, and then that student that comes with no words. How are you going to teach a child that can't respond to you back and forth? So I would say to the team that it would probably be a good idea to create a plan for that child who has no words to be able to advocate in that environment for themselves. So I mean, this I can't tell you what to do, okay, on a level of I am your I am your supervisor and I'm telling you to do this. I would highly recommend a child coming into a learning environment with zero auditory words should have some augmentative communication tool, whether it be a picture communication system, a little button that they say I'm here, or maybe they might have an object based communication system where they choose, or they have to have a way to participate in an environment that is a speaking environment if they are nonverbal, whether they're going to use sign language, gestures, whatever it is you choose to implement for that child. They have to have a way to say, because you're teaching them, and you want them to have a way to, if we go back to that communication bill of rights, you want them to have ability to participate, to advocate, to comment, like a lot of kids like that, how everybody else is commenting and saying, yes, I like this story. And how are they going to say, yes, they like that story also? you know they need a way to participate. Okay, so back to the plan. Let me check on my Um, Teresa, I think you might have chosen that you were typing the answer. Just choose that we answered it verbally. There you go. All right. Okay. So back to the communication plan, the one given by the state. So it's basically divided into 3 parts. The first section is the factors that you should consider, like what is happening right now in that student's environment that is either good or that needs to be improved. Okay, and I'm just explaining the document kind of like in a overview. So there's also appendices in the document, and there's the basic resources that the team could use. And then there is at the end of the document the actual action plan that the team is going to take and try to implement to provide communication opportunities. Okay, so hold on. I'm managing a couple things. All right. All right. So next section. Let's look at a case study so that a lot of people don't understand what we're talking about until we put an actual face on it. Okay. So we're going to look at a case study, and I'm just going to quickly kind of go over this particular child with you. without trying to read directly from the screen. So we're looking at a child, let's say her name's Jennifer, and she has intellectual disability and with a secondary exceptionality of orthopedic impairment. So basically she's diagnosed with cerebral palsy. So a lot of kids that are diagnosed with cerebral palsy, that's a brain to body thing where the brain's saying, move the hand, move the hand, move the hand. And the body's going, oh, it's going to get there 5, 10, 15 seconds later. And by the time you've asked the question, and by the time the child has tried to tell her body to answer in whatever mode, whether it's, with her mouth or with her body, the teachable moment has passed and you're like, oh, she doesn't know the answer. But she did know the answer. Her body just didn't allow her to respond fast enough. So a lot of times kids with cerebral palsy get kind of pushed off to the side and they're like, they don't understand. They don't understand. In reality, the body and the way of they communicate has to be really seriously considered so that they don't have such a long wait time. So basically, this child, as we can see, she communicates through vocalizations, facial expressions. She can reach and point at printed symbols. She uses already at 8 location static display with levels, meaning she can talk about a lot of different things. We just have to change those levels so she can elaborate. She can't change her own level, her own overlays. So she has to kind of signify, have something else to say. And then somebody has to come in and do that. Well, what if you're not paying attention and you miss that opportunity? She loves to interact with others. So she's very social, right? And she doesn't use her device outside of the classroom or in her home environments. So the problem with that is in those home environments and in other settings, she's sitting there wanting to say so much more, but she doesn't have a method to say it. Um, it doesn't matter. I'm telling my coworkers that they asked me a question. It doesn't matter. Okay. Sorry. Back to the content. Um, so, so she, there's probably lots of opportunities throughout all of her different environments that she could comment. She could, kind of like pose questions to the people that she wants to talk to, and she can add to conversations that she's hearing in those social environments, but she doesn't have that opportunity. So she has to resort to gestures, maybe vocalizations that don't make any sense. And then everybody looks at her and they go, oh, well, what do you want? What do you want? And she has no way to elaborate on what she's trying to say in those other environments because her AAC or her communication methods are not there. They're not in place. Okay. So this is what the communication plan is for. This is to talk about in those settings, what are we gonna do to facilitate communication for this child? All right, so let's take a look at the first page of the communication plan, which is basically just it's just the who, the why, the who, and the what. Okay. Um, right, just checking. So the why, the who, and the what. All right. So basically, the why of why you would create the communication plan. I kind of already went over that. We're talking about children with significant impairments in language. So we're looking at receptive and expressive language. So we're looking at how they receive language and how they express language. So for a child who is deaf, we need to be thinking about sign language. We need to think about like written language. So so it's very important that you look at that receptive language and you really dig deep in how that specific child receives messages. Okay, so if they're deaf blind, what are you going to do? Tactile for that child? I mean, it's a serious problem when you go into an environment where a child is deaf blind and there's nothing in front of them to engage. So that's like a big red light flashing. Okay. Um, all right, let's go to the next slide. So here is, again, just the planning process of what you need to consider while you're writing those communication plans. So the first section is identifying the child's primary language. So let me give the example of, let's say a child comes in to an English speaking school, and at home they're in a full Spanish speaking environment. I've seen this happen many times where the child does understand Spanish and can respond, in gesture with anything asked to them in their native language. But then they get to school and everything is in English. Well, they haven't been exposed to English, so they're not going to effectively respond. And so people are going to assume that the child doesn't know anything. When you need to actually consider, what are they speaking at home, and then make accommodations for that. So if you have to Google, how do you say welcome to school in Spanish, just so the child can nod and say thank you, you might have to do that with your technology or your device. So it's really important that you consider what is their native language, when you're writing out the communication plan. Okay.
Tammy, I have a little
Yes.
question.
Yes, ma'am.
She's wondering if this is a tool or is it mandated by the state?
Okay.
And she's saying as long as the child needs are considered or planned for and addressed on the IEP, isn't
Okay.
that okay?
Um, if I go back on my on slide 7, where I say what it is. So the plan. So this communication tool here is it's just a tool. This is not mandated. Okay. So a lot of districts have chosen to write their own tool for developing the plan. Now, so basically the process for considering communication needs and writing communication objectives, that process that the team might take to get there, to get to the end result, is not what's mandated. What's mandated is that you create a plan. You might write an objective for communication for a nonverbal child. So when you write that objective, that is what are the consideration, right? I'm sorry, I'm gonna show it to you. I'm gonna get to that. I'm gonna show you in the IEP where you have to make the statement. If you check off that the child is um let me get to that, okay? So my answer to that is that this specific thing you're looking at is not mandated. Okay. It is just a tool that the department created for you to come up with the end result, which is the basic statement that says, this is how we will communicate with this child. This is how the child will communicate back. That statement in the IEP is what is mandatory. Okay. For a child who has a severe communication problem, the IEP team must write a statement in the IEP that says, this is how we will communicate with that child. What I'm going through right here is kind of the work to get to that. Does that make sense? And did that answer the question? And if not, I'm going to elaborate more when I get to the IEP. Okay, I
Yes,
have
thank
30
you, Tammy.
minutes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, so again, I'm sorry. Let me get back to where I was. Sorry. All right. Okay, so section 1 is all about saying, is the child bilingual, or do they speak English? Does everybody speak English? Is that primary language? And then let's go down to the mode of communication, okay? So the mode of communication, when we say receptive, is what is being used to communicate to the student. So that receptive mode. So like if the child is, like I said earlier, if the child is hearing impaired or deaf, you have to figure out, how are they taking in the information? So what do I need to do as the teacher that's speaking for that child to be able to get that information in their brain, right? So if I might have to use sign language, I might have to use cued speech, I might have to use, like I said earlier, a tactile system for the child to understand what it is that's about to happen next. If the child is deaf blind, I have to give them a tactile way of being exposed to the content. Okay. So again, am I using no tech, mid tech, high tech? Okay. Receptively. Am I giving them printed symbols? Am I gesturing to them when I talk to them? I might use a modified sign language. I might point. I might use my facial expression. Now this is all receptive, okay? Um, let's go to the next section.
Tammy, I have another
Yes,
question.
ma'am.
The communication plan is similar to an individual healthcare plan. If written, does it get attached to the IEP as an IHCP does?
I would totally attach it. If I went to the trouble of going through this with a fine tooth comb with the team and everybody had input, I would definitely attach that. Now, is it mandatory? That's a question I don't know the answer to. Maybe we can reach out to the LDOE and ask them that question. So I hope I answered that okay. So we'd have to like inquire with the department. Is there anything else, Teresa?
No, ma'am, not at this time.
All right. Okay. Let me go back to. Okay, now let's talk about with the mode. Whenever you're thinking about mode and reception, you have to receptive communication. You have to think across all the environments that child's going to be asked to communicate. So I think this is where a lot of people drop the boat or drop the flag or whatever you want to call it. With this planning is that you think about the classroom and the classroom only. Well, what about whenever they get off the bus? What about whenever they are going to the cafeteria with their gen ed peers? What if they go to, if they're elementary, they go to recess? How are they going to communicate in every single environment with their peers? How are they going to communicate in the community? You know, a lot of times you'll push a kid around and like there's no way for you to for that child to say hello, you know, to their peers. You know, we need to not be thinking in the way of, well, they don't cognitively understand that. How do you know what they understand? If they have a motor impairment, a cerebral palsy, they might be trying to do something that whole time they're sitting there. When they see their best friend across the classroom or across the the park or whatever they're in, they might be trying to get their attention. And if they can't get their attention, then they're not effectively being able to express themselves. So we need to be thinking across all environments. All right, let's go next slide. All right, so let's talk about expressive a little bit. So we again talked about Jennifer. We're specifically still talking about Jennifer, and she communicates. How does she communicate in all environments? Um, we want to, if she uses like a modified sign, we and like when you're using modified sign in all environments, a lot of people don't know sign language, so it's not really a universal way to communicate to all people in all environments. So I'm not saying take away sign language, I'm saying provide a more universal way for her to do things, so that more people in her environment understand what it is she's trying to say. So, like, if you find that that child goes into environments and they have a way to do things, but all those people are not sure what that means, then you should have a low tech solution or a mid tech solution that accommodates that universal language. So, if she's trying to say hello and she says hello by tapping her wheelchair, a stranger is not going to know that's her method for saying hello. You're going to have to interrupt and say, when she taps her wheelchair, that means um, that she's saying hello. You don't want to have to be explaining a child's method of communication. You want it to be more universal across multiple environments. So that's where you want to come in and you want to teach how to communicate more universally. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Next. So right here, there's this method on their thing, on the communication plan that you kind of like give them a score. And there was a lot of communication back and forth about, well, what is this measured on, you know? And so they people wanted more guidance. So what I did in this particular slide, if you click on this image, it'll take you out to another slide that kind of explains what this scale could possibly represent. So like 1 for no use or no attempts to communicate the represented word, 2 for single word representation, 3 for, so what we're wanting right here is we're wanting the team to kind of score that child's ability and that child's language so that we can move from like a 1 to a 4 or a 1 to a 2 maybe. We want, like, when they use no attempts to communicate or represent a word, we want them to at least try to do a single word, or try to do, if they have a single word representation in those environments, then try to expand that to 2 word representation. And whether they're using like a low tech touch communication board and they're saying want it, or they might say want more by touching, want more, you might want to expand that as you're modeling to I want more, or um, I want more cookie, or I want more chip, you know. So definitely expanding that mode of communication. So we kind of did this as a guide on our team. And I mean, you don't have to use this particular scale, but it is a scale that you can use. And what's important about scale is that everybody understand this is the scale we're using and this is what we're talking about. So everybody on the same page with gauging where that child is. Okay. All right. So this section here, okay, this section here is super important in my opinion as a teacher, that we write down where are we in the environment providing opportunities for communication. So this kind of like gives you the opportunity to talk about it. Like, where are there opportunities throughout the day, both academic and social, for the student to interact with their peers that don't experience communication barriers? Because a lot of times you'll see kids, gen ed students, walk up to a child who is nonverbal and want to engage and want to interact, but yet that child that's nonverbal typically doesn't have a way to express themselves. So then the student kind of just stands there awkwardly and doesn't say anything. But if they had a mode or a method to say, "Hi, my name is so and so. What is your name?" They could engage in that back and forth communication with that peer. All right. So you want to be able to definitely facilitate uh, different opportunities throughout the day, not just in academic activities, but maybe when they're walking to lunch, maybe when they are, going back to the school bus or whatever. And then when you're in the classroom setting, where in the classroom setting are they going to actually be able to participate or engage? So for her, we use some examples like maybe a morning meeting where she could report the weather, or how is she going to say she might know the answer in a math activity, ELA. Um, so again, when they're participating, how is she going to do it? What device is she going to use? Is there a battery operated device with voice recorded on there in that environment? Or is it going to just be a low tech board? The thing about these kinds of modes is you can use more than one. You don't have to just use one way. Like, for instance, if you're going somewhere where the device is, um, it could get rained on, or wet, it can get wet or whatever, have a low tech backup for that child to point to what they're trying to say if they have that ability. Um, Definitely, it should not just be used in a speech therapy session. What should happen is we should be modeling the use of it all throughout the day, even though the child's not using it themselves at the moment fully. The teacher, as they talk to the child, can model the use of that language or that AAC system so that that child could see how it's used in the environment and possibly pick up that skill when they're motivated to talk. So definitely a child doesn't have to be talking in that mode completely and perfectly for the teacher not to be able to start modeling the use of that in the environment. Okay. um so if we look at um the D, where the student is independently authentically using the communication system, a lot of times the staff, the IEP teams will say no, they don't use it. We've been using it with them and they don't use it. I think that you never stop modeling the use of an augmentative communication system ever for a nonverbal child. A nonverbal child should always have a teacher, a paraeducator, a parent modeling a way to say language. It doesn't matter if they're not doing it the first time, the second time, the third time. You should always have a way for them to say words, whether it be by pointing to a picture or using an iPad to say it on on an iPad device or that talks. You should always be giving them the opportunity and showing them how to speak in another way if they're not verbally doing it. Even if they're verbally doing it and they're not expanding that language verbally, you should model it on a different device, a different way, so that maybe they might choose to expand their language using that augmentative communication tool. Now, we're not saying that they're going to need it forever. It might start encouraging, it might start where they're going to say things. Some kids actually do start talking more once they're given that opportunity to show how to communicate what they're thinking and what they're wanting to do. um so these questions right here are really important to answer as it pertains to what the child is currently doing in the environment. This is going to help the team think about where they want to take that child. Okay. And it's also going to show everybody, are there opportunities being given? Because a lot of times what the problem is that the child is not getting opportunities to communicate. We must create those opportunities for that child and wait to see what happens. Whether we think they can do it or they can't do it, that should not hinder us providing the opportunity to communicate. Okay. I can go on and on about that, but let me not. All right. So this next page is mainly for those students that are deaf and hard of hearing only. So if we're not talking about the students that are deaf and hard of hearing, we can kind of just gloss over this page and say it doesn't apply. Okay, the next page is the classroom consideration. It's the last part of the data collection process for consideration for communication. And so it just kind of goes into what kind of supports does the student need to participate and make progress in the general education curriculum. So basically, do they need a translator? Um, do they need an AAC device? Um, do they need an FM system to make it louder in the environment? How are they gonna take notes? How are they going to follow instructions? Do they need an assistive device? So notice at the bottom of this example, we have what additional language and communication supports are needed to help the student participate and make progress in the general education curriculum. So the first thing that's said is whatever system we're using to communicate with the child should be modeled by everyone in the environment. So that is going to take practice by everyone. The teacher's going to have to model, the speech therapist has to model. So it may start from the speech therapist modeling how to use that mode of communication, and then the teacher should pick that modeling up. A paraeducator should pick that modeling up, and at some point, it's really recommended for the parent to come in and get trained on how to model that language, so that everybody talking to that child in every single environment is using the same mode to communicate, so that that child can learn their system. So if we look at how a baby learns to speak, one person doesn't auditorily talk to that child as a baby. Every single person in that baby's environment talks verbally to that child for hours and hours and hours before that baby says, Mama, or No, or I want that. So we don't give these AAC users, these kids that use an alternative mode to communicate, we don't give them half of the exposure and the practice to their device before we say, oh, it's not working. So, what I'm encouraging everybody out there that needs to do communication plans is please give a lot of exposure to that device and never stop modeling, because I think what happens is the team get a little bit discouraged the first week of use when the child doesn't do it back. What you need to understand is that it could be months, it could be years before the child talks back on that device. The child needs a way to express themselves if they're going to show that they know. And that's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to show us in our language what they know. So you need to be modeling and you need to never stop modeling. Do I have a question? All right. I have 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, so the strategies, this is important for maybe the speech therapist or people on the team to write out what the strategies are for incidental learning opportunities so that we can encourage more practice throughout the day. So as you can see, this is again writing what strategies are utilized. And this is again still the data collection part, saying that we don't practice enough. The team has to admit where we were at fault. And a lot of times the team just does not provide enough opportunities and no one's modeling the communication method. So this part right here is to say, look, we're not doing what we need to do in order for that child to have the opportunities to do what they possibly can learn to do. Okay. So you need to have faith. All right, here is the final page 9 where we actually write in here the action plan for communication and language support. Okay, so what we write in this section is what we're going to also fill in on the IEP. So right here in instructional settings, we say that Jennifer, the team is going to utilize symbol sticks for core and fringe words. The speech therapist and the special ed teacher will consult on vocabulary that they're going to introduce. We're going to honor any appropriate communication attempt from her, that it consists of vocalizations, pointing or reaching, facial expressions. So what that statement means is that when she points and goes, we're going to honor that as saying, I want, or look at that. Or when a child points and that means that she's trying to draw attention to what it is she's pointing at. And so in language, that might say, look at that. So the teacher's going to go on her device and they're going to say, you're saying, look at that. Or you're going to say, look at the book. Or whatever it is that the team determines that means, that's going to be modeled in their communication language system that you're practicing with, right? So, and we're looking at instructional settings, we're looking at assessments, and we're looking at extracurricular activities, right? So all those areas we might want to write an objective for, or we might write the same objective across all areas. Okay, so right here under 3, it says, what assistive technology must the student use to access the general education curriculum? You're going to say they're going to use low-tech boards. They might use, they might use high-tech. They might use dynamic display. They could use more than one in different environments. Okay, so you're going to make a statement as the IEP team, what did you decide they're going to use to communicate effective language? All right. And then describe how the student's receptive and expressive communication support needs will be addressed. So in environments, it says the device will be presented in all environments and training needs to be provided for all personnel using the device and modeling the use of it. Social context, you're going to create opportunities for her to interact with her peers outside of the classroom, for example, assemblies, recess, lunch, etc. Instructional content areas, you're going to have low and high tech tools that would be used to teach the academic content. She's going to use the tools to express what she knows, and all personnel will teach and model the new vocabulary in functional activities. Okay. Describe the individual support. The student will increase his or her receptive or expressive communication skills and language. So how we're going to increase the use of that language. So what are teachers going to do? What are school staff going to do? What are parents going to do? And what are peers going to do? So writing this clearly out in this plan is going to help promote the growth of it. So for you to have a clear statement of what are teachers going to do? So teachers are going to develop a plan to introduce new vocabulary. They're going to so the teacher is going to use the words of the week idea to create a word wall and vocabulary with symbol stick symbols. So every new week, they're going to have new vocabulary, and the teacher's going to put that on a word wall. She's going to show the child a symbol and maybe add that to whatever device they're using. And they're going to that's how they're going to do new vocabulary lessons. The school staff, everybody's going to be aware of what words are being uh, and that introduce and how to model those words. Maybe they might have a vocabulary word on the child's tray on their wheelchair, and the school staff can know that these are the new words that they're learning. So everybody just needs to be exposed to how they're communicating, and then the parents are going to have training on how to use the tools and how to model communication in the home environment. Um, and so what's going to happen for peers is that they're going to have opportunities to communicate, whether it be in the hallway, social settings, in the cafeteria with that child. And they might have a little bit of training that shows how to respond, but the students are going to still verbally talk to the child. There might just be told, well, this is how the child's going to talk back to you using this mode of communication, whether it's a communication device that they're using on their wheelchair, or whether it's a low-tech pointing to picture communication device. We're going to just expose those peers to that and tell them how the child is communicating. All right. So what type of training? This gets into who needs to be trained, how much training do they need, and how is the IEP team going to facilitate that training? And then again, this question 7, 8, 7 and below are for students that are deaf and hard of hearing. So that's specific to them. Like, um, like for instance, how the child needs to bring their hearing aid. They need to be responsible for that. It is not the teacher's responsibility. Uh, Also, if a child is using a AAC system, how are we going to manage keeping that thing charged and such? So we all have to talk about all those technical issues that happen that prevent the use of the device. Like, where is it in the space? Is it up on the shelf somewhere collecting dust and nobody ever takes it down and puts it in front of the child? So we need to write down specifically who's charging it, who's making sure it's in front of the child. Because if the child has a physical motor disability, they can't go get the device that they're using. It must be put in front of them at all times. Okay, so who's responsible for doing that? The team is. All right, documenting on the IP. I have what, 6 minutes left. I'm hurrying up. Okay, so this is in the student general information on the IEP. When you deem that child significantly impaired in in verbal communication, whereas they cannot verbally communicate to express themselves effectively. If you check that off on the IEP, you must write a statement here. This is what's mandatory. Okay, this is what is mandated by the state. In the IEP, you must make a statement. Now, everything I went over, those 16 pages of documentation, sorry, I'm choking. That was all the planning process, right? So this statement holds the most weight right here in the IEP, okay? This is going to say what the team decided for communication plan, okay? So again, underneath assistive technology services, I'm sorry, I'm choking. You have to write what device y'all decided they're going to use. And these two blocks right here is what's mandated. Can you create these statements without going through all the other stuff? Absolutely. If you know all your bells and whistles, you don't need to write that. But what those other questions allow the team is a conversation, a true, real conversation about what's actually happening for that child in every environment. Okay. So, absolutely, you do not have to use that planning document. Some districts have already created a modified planning document for their teams to use, which is totally fine. What is mandated is what you write in these two blocks. Now, if you just write some few statements and that's all you do, and you got a child who is starting to, by mid-year, have severe behavior problems, guess what now you have to write because they can't communicate? A behavior plan. And guess what that behavior plan should involve? A communication plan on how the child is communicating in the environment so that the behavior doesn't escalate. All right. So I don't know if your team has ever had that type of child that goes from no communication to straight behavior plan. That is a big red flag that shows that the child that can't communicate effectively in the environment resorts to behaviors that are not appropriate. All right. So here's a few resources. I'm wrapping up. Oh God, I have to wrap up. Here's a few resources in my session. I'm going to open up the platform for any questions. And if no questions are necessary or needed or you don't have any questions, we're going to end the session.
Hey, Tammy, there's two comments that some panelists wanted to share.
Okay.
One was from Michael Norman: attaching the communication plan to the IEP is an LEA decision. At the time the tool was developed by the Louisiana Department of Education, it did not mandate the tool use nor how the tool was to be retained by the LEA.
Okay.
The second one is from Krista Folks. The communication plan is mandated for all deaf, hard of hearing, and or deaf-blind students as indicated in the Deaf Blind Child Bill of Rights that was written in 2016, Act 250. It is now required by law.
Okay. All right. So I hope if anybody had any questions about those two things that answered them. So for children who are deaf and hard of hearing, it has to be done, basically.
Okay, there's
And so I guess I have more experience with kids that are nonverbal and more significantly disabled. And I know there was a lot of communication about, do we have to do it? Do we not have to do it? Basically, that statement must be made in the IEP for those types of students. In my resources page right here, we have some sample parish plans of what parishes decided to do. And then again, the LDOE communication support, which takes you out to this page here on the DOE. And if you scroll down to the middle of the page where it says communication support, you can find that Act 250 guidance and more helpful websites for children with communications. So I'm going to stop now, and Josh is going to talk about this here, which is what's going to happen when you leave our session if you need a certificate. Josh?
Yes, thank you, Tammy. So, guys,